Have you experienced moments in your life when the pressure to be visible, accessible, and constantly available felt like it was slowly eroding something essential inside you, as if the relentless demand to perform socially was quietly suffocating the person you were meant to become? Maybe you felt the weight of notifications, the obligation to reply instantly, the subtle but persistent anxiety that if you step back, even for a moment, you'll somehow cease to exist in the eyes of others. Modern culture has taught us that visibility equals value, that presence is proof of worthiness, that silence is suspicion. But what if everything you've been taught about growth, transformation, and becoming your strongest self is fundamentally incomplete? What if the very act of remaining visible is the single greatest obstacle standing between you and the person you're capable of becoming? Carl Jung, one of the most profound explorers of the human psyche, discovered something that modern psychology often ignores. Real transformation doesn't happen under the gaze of others. It demands withdrawal. It requires disappearance, not as escape or surrender, but as a deliberate, courageous act of reconstruction. Jung called this the conscious descent, a purposeful retreat from the noise, the expectations, the endless performance of identity. In his clinical work, he observed that the patients who experienced the deepest, most lasting transformations were precisely those who dared to vanish for a time, who cancelled their commitments, who stepped away from social obligations, who entered what he called a state of sacred unavailability. And in that hidden space, far from external demands, they discovered something they could never find in the noise: their own essence. Before we go deeper, if this resonates with you and you want to continue this journey of self-discovery, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and activate notifications. Every week, we explore the profound intersections of Jungian psychology, spirituality, conscious living, and the practices that lead to genuine self-knowledge. Think of this as a practical series, a weekly progression into the depths of who you truly are. You'll find additional resources, reflections, and guided pathways in the pinned comment and the description below. Now, back to the paradox that defines our era. The more visible you are, the less capable you become of genuine transformation. The uncomfortable truth is this: you cannot become someone new while everyone around you still treats you as who you were. Your constant presence in the world, whether physical or digital, functions as an anchor pulling you back into old patterns. Every notification, every message, every casual interaction reaffirms who you used to be. And when you're trying to become your strongest self, that constant reaffirmation is silent sabotage. The greatest prison of the 21st century has no bars, no walls, no locks. It's constructed from notifications, invitations, mentions, and likes. It's an invisible but relentless prison, built on the demand to always be present, at work, on social media, in group chats, at events, in every interaction. The logic is clear and brutal. If you don't appear, you don't exist. But Jung recognized what few dare to admit: this constant visibility is destroying the possibility of profound transformation. Uninterrupted social presence condemns us to live under the reflection of who we were, never who we are becoming. Every time you interact with someone, that person treats you based on the old version they know. Even if you're already in transition, even if internally you're trying to change, there's no space for the new when everyone around you keeps reinforcing the old. It's like trying to swim against the current of others' expectations. This phenomenon is subtle but devastating. You reply to a message from someone who's known you since childhood, and immediately you feel the pressure to be that same insecure teenager. You attend a social event and almost automatically activate the same behavioral patterns, the same jokes, the same roles. Nothing changes because you're surrounded by mirrors that only reflect what already was. Jung understood that the human psyche is malleable, yes, but also highly suggestible. And when we're constantly immersed in environments that define us by our past, the chance of emerging as a new version diminishes drastically. That's why he observed in his clinical practice that the patients who evolved most were those who interrupted the cycle of visibility, those who dared to say no to the world, not out of contempt, but out of necessity. They withdrew, they disappeared, and in that disappearance, they created enough psychological space to rebuild themselves. You might think you're evolving by reading books, listening to podcasts, watching videos like this. But if every day you're forced to perform the same identity for others, your internal progress will always be compromised. It's like planting a seed and digging up the soil every hour to see if it's grown. Disappearing, even for a time, is an act of liberation. It's refusing the social role that was imposed on you to discover who you are without an audience, without applause, without external expectations. It's silencing the noise of the world to finally hear your own voice. But this disappearance must be done strategically, with intention, method, and discipline. It's not enough to simply hide. You must rebuild. Few truly understand what it means to isolate oneself. Most see isolation as cowardly escape, emotional collapse, or a sign of weakness. But Jung saw it from another angle, as a psychological rite of passage. He called this movement the conscious descent and considered it one of the most fundamental steps toward genuine transformation. The conscious descent isn't simply stopping socializing with friends or deleting social media like a weekend detox. It's a radical, intentional decision to break for a period, with social roles, public performance, constant distraction, and to dive into a space where the true self can finally emerge without judgment, without audience, without filters. Jung lived this experience personally. After his rupture with Freud, he withdrew from everything, from the spotlight of the scientific community, from social obligations, even from his conventional clinical practice. Instead of seeking answers in books or from others, he built his tower in Bollingen on the shores of Lake Zurich. And there he began a profound process of self-exploration. For years in isolation, Jung drew mandalas, wrote in his diary, the Red Book, sculpted stones, walked, and reflected. While the world tried to understand his silence, he was in the process of reconstruction. This period wasn't romantic. It was dense, turbulent, disorienting. The silence of isolation isn't comfortable. It exposes. When you disconnect from external distractions, you inevitably confront what's inside. Your anxieties have nowhere left to hide. Your repressed desires scream. Your contradictions emerge like ghosts. And it's precisely here that the real work begins. The conscious descent is a kind of underworld of the psyche. It's like exploring a dark cave with a torch in hand, trying to understand what lies in the depths of your being. And this journey can be frightening because you'll encounter parts of yourself that you've rejected for years. Fears, traumas, masks, shadows. But it's in this underground that your power resides. Jung affirmed that all individuation, that is, the process of becoming who you truly are, begins with this initial rupture from the external world. To be reborn, you must die symbolically, and that death is strategic disappearance. It's ceasing to exist as others know you, to discover who you really are without the layers that were built to please, to fit in, to survive. But disappearance alone isn't enough. Disappearing without direction can lead to alienation. Isolation needs structure, intention, practice. Jung didn't retreat into inertia. He created an environment where he could do the necessary internal work. He built a space of action, not passivity. And this is what you need to understand. Effective disappearance isn't the end of movement. It's the beginning of new construction. There are 4 practical pillars to transform isolation into a solid foundation for a new identity. The first pillar is radical reduction of availability. You need to cut the compulsive connection with the external world. This means turning off notifications, establishing periods when you're absolutely unreachable, and stopping justifying your absence as if you owe explanations all the time. You don't owe anyone an account of your time. This is the beginning of personal sovereignty. When you limit others' access to you, something powerful happens. You recover your attention, your energy, your focus. And more importantly, you begin to reverse the logic that conditioned you to be a social character 24 hours a day. The second pillar is elimination of passive consumption. Attack what keeps you reactive. News, social media, short videos, excessive entertainment. All of this feeds your mind with noise and fragments your attention. Jung knew that the mind needs silence to metabolize the unconscious. If you're constantly consuming, you're distancing yourself from your own internal creation. The goal here is to replace passivity with production. Write, create, develop something. Transform time previously occupied by distraction into time of expression. Stop being a spectator and become the protagonist. The third pillar is creation of reconstruction routines. Now that you've silenced the world and ceased useless consumption, establish routines that solidify your new identity. This includes practices like deep reading, reflective writing, intense physical exercise, learning new skills, and working on projects with real meaning. Jung deeply valued the connection between body and psyche and knew that concrete action reinforces internal movement. Here, you rebuild discipline, clarity, and strength. With each repetition, you reaffirm your commitment to your new version. The fourth pillar is a transformation journal. The last pillar is documentation of your rebirth. Not for others, but for yourself. A journal where you write every day, not about what happened, but about who you're becoming. This journal is your internal mirror, your psychological laboratory, your map. It's where you recognize old patterns and celebrate the emergence of new behaviors. Writing is anchoring the invisible in the visible. It's giving form to what's still gestating within you. These four pillars aren't loose ideas. They're concrete practices that Jung, in his own life, used to rebuild himself after his rupture with the scientific world and his existential crisis. They represent a direct path, though not comfortable, to individuation. It's not an easy process. It demands discipline, courage, and above all, brutal honesty with who you are and who you're not yet. But even with all these practices in action, isolation inevitably brings confrontation. Silence. And within silence, an enemy even more dangerous than the external world, yourself. There's a moment in strategic disappearance when everything becomes quiet. The noise of networks disappears, messages stop arriving, invitations cease, and the world, which before seemed so urgent, becomes distant, almost irrelevant. For many, this silence seems liberating, but in truth, it's the real test, because it's precisely in this silence that what you've tried to avoid your entire life appears, yourself. The pain of silence isn't physical, it's psychic. It installs itself as a discomfort you can't name. In the first days of isolation, your mind will try to sabotage you with distractions. Return to Instagram just for a minute, reply to that friend just to not seem rude, open YouTube because you deserve a break. But with discipline, if you resist, this fog begins to dissipate, and that's when the true voices emerge. The human mind, when not anesthetized by the continuous flow of stimuli, begins to project outward what was stored in the basement of consciousness. And what was there? Old fears, regrets you pretended to forget, unresolved angers, abandoned dreams, parts of yourself that were silenced to fit into the molds of what others expected from you. Jung spoke about this with brutal clarity. The process of individuation begins when the ego is confronted with the unconscious. And this confrontation frequently occurs through psychic suffering, not because you're broken, but because for the first time you're in contact with parts of yourself that were repressed. Silence exposes, silence undresses. It doesn't forgive, But it's in this moment, when everything seems uncomfortable, strange, chaotic, that you begin to see more clearly. You realize how much you lived reacting to the world instead of creating your life. How much your decisions were based on the need for approval, fear of rejection, maintenance of an image that never represented your essence. In silence, you perceive the theater. And here's the truth. This discomfort is necessary. It's a sign that the masks are beginning to fall. Jung understood that there's no light without first facing the darkness. The pain of silence is the womb of transformation. It's where the new identity begins to form, even if imperceptibly. It's in discomfort that old patterns begin to crumble. It's in solitude that clarity flourishes. But this doesn't mean the work is finished. On the contrary, it's now that true transformation begins, because it's not enough to deconstruct. It's necessary to rebuild a new identity, a version of yourself that wasn't born to please, but to exist with integrity. And this rebirth doesn't happen publicly. It happens in the dark, in silence, like everything sacred. After weeks or months of strategic disappearance, disciplined silence, and deep internal work, something changes. But not explosively. Real transformation happens slowly, like a plant growing beneath the earth, invisible to external eyes, but implacable in its force. And then comes the moment to reappear, to return to social life, to the world, to external existence. But here's the irony. When done correctly, reappearing is never a return to what you were. It's emergence, revelation, psychological reincarnation. People look at you but don't recognize. They can't explain what changed. Your face is the same, your voice is the same, but there's something there that disturbs, a kind of presence, clarity, firmness that didn't exist before. And this destabilizes them because they expected to find the you they always knew, the one who accepted everything, who fit in, who followed the rules of the invisible game. But now before them stands someone who no longer needs external validation, someone who no longer molds themselves to others' projections, someone who was forged in the fire of silence. The return then is almost anticlimactic for the external world, because while everyone was worried about maintaining appearances, you were digging deep. You didn't return to be noticed, you returned to live authentically. And that's why your mere presence becomes uncomfortable for those still trapped in false versions of themselves. Jung saw this transformation as the inevitability of the individuation process. He said that the true self can only emerge when the ego is restructured, when superficial identifications are undone. When this happens, the subject stops being reactive. They become the creator of their own path. They're no longer conducted by the world. They guide their experience within it. The most interesting thing is that upon returning, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. There's no need to explain where you've been, what you did, what you learned, because the result is in your gaze, in your posture, in your choices, in your selective absences, in the silent firmness with which you refuse to lower yourself to old standards. You stopped being a mirror for others, and now they can no longer see themselves in you. This can frighten, it can distance people, but it can also inspire, because all authentic transformation activates the collective unconscious. It disturbs the complacent and awakens the dormant. This new you is a hybrid being between the old and the reborn, a being who integrated the shadows, who learned to be alone, who faced their own demons and returned with wisdom. And now, in place of anxiety to belong, there's peace. In place of fear of rejection, integrity. In place of performance, presence. Disappearing from the world for a time isn't a simple choice. It's an act of courage. It's the modern equivalent of entering the dark cave we fear most. And as Joseph Campbell said, it's there that we find the treasure we seek. Strategic disappearance isn't just a pause. It's an alchemical process. You enter as a fragmented person, conditioned, lost in others' expectations, and emerge as a whole individual, lucid, conscious of your own power. Carl Jung understood this profoundly. He knew that no true transformation occurs under constant observation. Psychic growth is an internal, intimate phenomenon that demands withdrawal. Like a snake shedding its skin, you need to rid yourself of what no longer serves. And this is a solitary, painful, but absolutely necessary process. What few understand is that true freedom isn't doing what you want when you want. True freedom is no longer being hostage to what others think about who you are. It's living aligned with what pulses within you, even if the world doesn't applaud, even if it criticizes, even if it walks away. Because when you become your strongest self, you begin to live based on principles, not impulses, with direction, not distraction, with presence, not performance. And this version of you, forged in silence, molded by discipline, sustained by internal practices, is invincible. It doesn't live to please. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't beg for attention. It simply is. And this being is magnetic, authentic, transformative. You become a presence that inspires not because you try, but because you exist with real depth. Strategic disappearance, therefore, isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new life, a life in which you don't just survive. You build, create, lead, serve, live with purpose. The world around will continue the same, but the way you inhabit it will be completely different, and that changes everything. But there's a deeper layer to this process that must be addressed. Because disappearing and rebuilding isn't only about you. It's about what happens when your transformation begins to affect the world around you. When your absence becomes a statement. When your silence starts to speak louder than any words you could have said. When you vanish strategically, you create a void. And voids are powerful because they force others to confront what they took for granted. Your constant availability, your predictable responses, your compliance, all of this formed an invisible structure in other people's lives. And when you remove yourself, that structure collapses. Some will feel abandoned, others will feel threatened. Many will project their own fears onto your absence, creating narratives that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with their inability to understand transformation. They'll say you changed in a bad way, that you became arrogant, distant, cold. But what really happened is that you stopped being the reflection they needed to avoid looking at themselves. Jung spoke extensively about projection, the psychological mechanism through which we attribute to others what we cannot accept in ourselves. When you disappear to rebuild, you become a mirror that no longer reflects what others want to see, and this triggers discomfort, resistance, even hostility. But here's the essential truth. Their discomfort is not your responsibility. Your transformation doesn't require consensus. It doesn't need approval. The moment you understand this, you free yourself from one of the most subtle and destructive prisons, the need to be understood by everyone. Because the reality is that most people will never understand what you're doing. They live on the surface, reacting to life rather than creating it, and your decision to dive deep will always seem incomprehensible to them. And that's perfectly fine. Your path isn't meant to be walked by everyone. It's meant to be walked by you. But within this process of disappearance and reconstruction, there's a psychological phenomenon that Jung identified as crucial: the encounter with the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is everything you've rejected about yourself, the parts you've deemed unacceptable, shameful, weak, or dangerous. These rejected parts don't disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious, forming a kind of hidden counterpart to your conscious identity. And when you enter strategic isolation, when you remove all external distractions, the shadow emerges with full force. This is the most uncomfortable phase of the process because you come face to face with aspects of yourself you've spent years avoiding. Maybe it's repressed anger that you've always masked with kindness. Maybe it's ambition you've hidden under false humility. Maybe it's sexuality you've suppressed beneath spiritual pretenses. Maybe it's fear you've disguised as caution. Whatever it is, isolation brings it to light. And the natural impulse is to reject it again, to push it back down, to return to distraction, to avoid the confrontation. But Jung taught that integration of the shadow is essential for individuation. You cannot become whole while rejecting parts of yourself. The strongest version of you isn't the one that's purely light, purely virtuous, purely controlled. It's the one that has integrated darkness, vice, chaos, and transformed these energies into conscious power. This integration doesn't mean acting on every impulse or justifying destructive behavior. It means acknowledging what exists within you, understanding its origin, and consciously deciding how to channel that energy. When you integrate your shadow, you stop being a fragmented person living in constant internal conflict, and you become a unified being with access to the full spectrum of your psychological power. And this is when real strength emerges, not the fragile strength of someone who's never been tested, but the solid strength of someone who has descended into their own depths and returned intact. Strategic disappearance also forces you to confront one of the most fundamental questions of human existence. Who am I when no one is watching? This question terrifies most people because they've constructed their entire identity based on external feedback. They are what others say they are. They exist through validation, through likes, through approval, through recognition. Remove all of that, and they collapse into existential confusion. But this confusion is the gateway to authenticity, because when you strip away all social roles, all masks, all performances, what remains is the raw material of your true self, unpolished, unfiltered, undeniable. And working with this raw material is the essence of Jungian individuation. You begin to notice patterns in your behavior that have nothing to do with who you want to be, and everything to do with conditioning, trauma, and unconscious programming. You see how much of your life has been lived on autopilot, how many decisions were made out of fear rather than desire, how many relationships were maintained out of obligation rather than genuine connection. And with this awareness comes the opportunity to choose differently. You can consciously design your life rather than passively accepting what was handed to you. You can define your values rather than inheriting them. You can create your purpose rather than adopting someone else's. But this requires time, silence, and space, the very things that strategic disappearance provides. It's in the absence of external noise that your internal voice becomes audible. And that voice, though often quiet, is the most reliable guide you have. Jung called this inner voice the self, the archetype of wholeness, and the ultimate goal of individuation. The self isn't the ego. It's the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, human and divine. And connecting with the self requires withdrawal from the ego's constant need for validation and control. It requires trust in a process that cannot be rushed, manipulated, or performed for an audience. It requires faith that beneath all the layers of conditioning and fear, there is something real, something true, something worth discovering. Another critical aspect of this process is learning to distinguish between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the painful feeling of being disconnected from others, of lacking meaningful relationships, of being unseen and unheard. Solitude, on the other hand, is the conscious choice to be alone, to create space for self-reflection, to cultivate a relationship with yourself. Most people fear solitude because they confuse it with loneliness. They believe that being alone means being abandoned, rejected, or inadequate. But Jung understood that solitude is a sacred state, a necessary condition for psychological growth. In solitude, you're not running from connection. You're deepening your connection with the most important person in your life, yourself. And paradoxically, the more comfortable you become in solitude, the more capable you become of genuine connection with others. Because you're no longer seeking relationships to fill a void or validate your existence. You're engaging with others from a place of wholeness, offering your authentic self rather than a carefully curated performance. This shift transforms every relationship in your life. You stop attracting people who need you to be small so they can feel big. You stop tolerating dynamics that drain your energy or compromise your integrity. You start recognizing and honoring relationships that are reciprocal, respectful, and rooted in mutual growth. And all of this begins with your willingness to be alone, to sit with yourself, to face whatever arises without distraction or escape. Strategic disappearance also reveals the illusion of urgency that dominates modern life. Everything feels urgent. Messages that need immediate responses, emails that can't wait, social obligations that demand your presence, content that must be consumed right now or you'll fall behind. But when you step back, when you remove yourself from the constant flow of demands, you realize that very little is actually urgent. Most of what feels urgent is simply noise designed to keep you reactive, distracted, and disconnected from your own path. The world will continue without your constant participation. People will solve their own problems. Trends will come and go. And you, in your absence, will be doing something far more valuable, building a foundation for a life of meaning, purpose, and authentic power. Jung himself withdrew from the frantic pace of academic life and clinical fame to do his most important work. The Red Book, his exploration of active imagination, his development of key psychological concepts, all of this emerged from periods of intense solitude and introspection. He understood that depth requires time, that insight cannot be rushed, that transformation happens in its own rhythm, and this rhythm is almost always slower than the world would prefer. But the results are incomparably more valuable. A life built on depth rather than speed, on intention rather than reaction, on presence rather than performance. This is the life that strategic disappearance makes possible. There's also a spiritual dimension to this process that cannot be ignored. Disappearing to rebuild isn't just a psychological strategy, it's a spiritual practice. Across cultures and traditions, withdrawal has been recognized as essential for spiritual awakening. Monks entering monasteries, shamans journeying into the wilderness, mystics retreating into caves. These weren't acts of weakness or escape. They were deliberate choices to create the conditions for transcendence, for communion with something greater than the ego.